Also, welcome to Reading Solutions UK's first international reading conference. For those who haven't heard of Reading Solutions, they work with schools to improve pupils' reading fluency, stamina and comprehension through their online reading development program, Reading Plus. So my name is Creatinga Digital. I'm an author, founder of Children's Literature Festivals charity, and I'm also patron of Blackburn with Darwin Libraries for Children and Young People. And when I was asked to host this conference, I was really quite excited about it because a lot of the stuff, well, everything on here resonates with what I do and what I kind of stand for with the charity as well. So we've had some really interesting speakers so far. And so we're excited that you've all joined Al Kingsley, CEO of NetSupport, and Andrew Yeomans, Director of the Education Exchange session about EdTech and digital strategies. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and Al and Andrew will aim to answer them all at the end of the session. So now I'm going to hand you over to Al Kingsley and Andrew Yeomans.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session. We're going to be talking about creating a digital vision, which is always an all-encompassing term, and more importantly, how we move that dial forward and focus on how we can follow the evidence. And there's a nice slide that's popped up there. A bit of a confession. Normally, if we're face-to-face in a conference, we'd be talking about warnings about a fire drill or exits to the left and right. On this one, it's more about the fact that Andrew and I are going to be going on a bit of a wander on this presentation. First time we've been presenting together. So it's going to be a bit of an EdTech therapy session. And what we're hoping to do as part of this session is really tease out some of those key questions that get asked and share from our experiences. And it's lovely overlap because we both come from different directions, tackling the same challenges and hopefully posing the same solutions. So I really hope you find it interesting. And as always, if you please do reach out and connect with us after the session if you'd like to continue the conversation. Let's do the formal bit. Who are we and what do we do? So I'm Al Kingsley. I'm Group CEO of NetSupport. 30 years working in the EdTech space, developing classroom instructional technology, online safety and IT management tools. Wearing my other education hat, I'm chair of a multi-academy trust, chair of an alternative provision academy. I sit on the Regional Schools Commissioners Advisory Board for the East of England and chair our region's SEND board. So lots of different strands all around a passion for education. Andrew, over to you, sir.
Okay, maybe not as impressive as you, Al, but I'll give it a whirl. I was led one of the highest performing EdTech demonstrators a couple of years ago, and now I'm the Director of the Education Exchange. And probably to put that into context with regards to what is the Education Exchange, ultimately it is interdependent school improvement. There is a collection, cooperative, commonwealth of members of the Education Exchange who put competition to one side and collaborate together to raise outcomes and opportunities for all pupils. And ultimately what that means is if someone's had some success in a specific school improvement area, we take the experts from that setting, put them in another setting to implement and lead that change as the experts in another setting that wants to have the same impact in the same area in a similar way. And as the EdTech Demonstrator program's coming to an end in September, one of the things that the Education Exchange is looking to make sure that they put on offer as some of their projects is that e-learning support, that EdTech support. And that's it. Should we get cracking now?
I think we should.
Okay. So the format that we've got, we should probably just say a little bit about that, shouldn't we, Al? So ultimately, we've got a couple of slides, all structured, hopefully using common sense around some hot topics. And we're just going to go back and forth and talk about those. Now, I'm sure we will go off on a tangent, Al. We've had some brief chats prior to this. On it. But we'll be able to pull ourselves back with those slides as well. And let's see, maybe it'll be an interesting conversation. Maybe we won't align in every area, but we will see. It's all about constructive growth, isn't it? And professional collaboration. So, digital vision should be led by the tech, right? Over to you, Al. Do you want to take this first one?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think we've intentionally posed it as a starter for 10. Depending on how far back we look, and probably it's not that many years, in many schools and organisations, the digital vision was very much the domain of the IT manager, the network manager, and perhaps the speed of that journey was controlled by the school bursar or the finance director of the organization. And I guess what we've learned is very much that when we're talking about vision, and this is something that you and I know are very strongly aligned on, that vision at the heart has to always be about teachers and children, that pedagogy, the focus on teaching and learning. But what we've also realized, particularly over the last couple of years, is that actually no one person can possibly have all the answers to all the questions. And actually the measure of a successful digital vision is making sure there's sufficient breadth of people who understand what we're trying to achieve and why we're trying to achieve it. So typically when I'm talking about this area, I tend to pull up a rather basic Venn diagram and really talk about, let's think about that heart, about having our teaching and learning. Let's make sure that our senior leadership team, of course, are driving, particularly aligning with our school development plan and our priorities. We'll, of course, want the network manager to be there and having an input and insight. We don't want to be building on sandy land if we haven't got the right IT infrastructure to support our aspirations and visions. Big topics now we'll be thinking about data privacy, SEND, making sure we're thinking about technology and our digital vision that aligns for our DSL and our safeguarding considerations, making sure we're meeting all the obligations. There will, of course, be feedback from trustees and governors, I hope. Bit of challenge, why are we doing what we're doing and how are we going to measure it? And then I always link finance at the end, really, which is to say finance very much should dictate the speed of the journey, not the direction. And I think that's something that's a shift for particularly smaller schools. And then around all of that, something I know that you feel very strongly about, so I'm going to hand back to you in a second, is also about actually all of that is empowered by having a clear vision about the training and continuous professional development, how we're actually going to support that vision and move it forwards.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, really. When we work with EdTech, as an EdTech demonstrator with schools, it's all about their vision, what they're trying to achieve, looking at all those different components. And yeah, likewise, we have a Venn diagram, and actually it's almost like a golden circle that's about effective pedagogy. And no matter what decision or what else is going on in any of those other areas, we have to make sure that the decision still fits within that golden circle, because ultimately that's that why. And ultimately, as long as you've got that clear intention, that clear vision, and a criteria that you can make decisions against, actually you can make small steps, depending on capacity, depending on funding, in the right direction. And actually sometimes smaller steps, quickly taken, actually can get you to that intended destination quicker than actually, oh, wait a second, we've made a decision, oh, here is a solution, or here is a fix. All of a sudden it's a case of, oh, well, is it doing what we wanted it to do? We're not sure. We haven't been on that journey of development, of discovery, of understanding, of empowerment ourselves. And so you're then back to square one, reevaluating, but it's had a hit on your budget potentially, and it's been learning time wasted.
I think there's also a strand here when we think about vision and building a digital vision as if it's a one-hit process. And I always think, well, you can start, if you haven't got one, to shape and build something. But much like undertaking ESF every year, it's a constantly moving beast, reflecting and reacting to your cohort, both your student and teaching cohort, and where those pressures and challenges are for engagement. And
you touched as well upon speaking to people, getting out there. And I know I've seen the other presentations of yours, Al, and you like your musical links to different slides, and the first one was a Vanilla Ice one around stop, collaborate and listen. And I think there's a key element there. It's a case of, right, let's stop, let's take stock of what's already out there, what's working well for people, what they can show proven sustainable impact with, what that actually is, whether that aligns to what your intentions are. And making sure you're actually aware and informed about the best practice out there, looking at the research, so that actually it's not a case of it being, oh, this is impressive, or this is shiny, or it looks like this is what we want. It's actually, I know what it is. That empowers you throughout that journey to make sure that you can identify what the impact is, and then adjust as needed.
Absolutely. And what people I hope will pick up during this conversation is much of what we share is not rocket science, and it's certainly not technical. I think back to many of the big district rollouts in the US of new technology, and more often than not, the number one barrier to success, why the adoption wasn't as successful as it could have been, was because technology was deployed without all of the stakeholders and within that top of the list, I include frontline teaching staff, actually understanding what it was we were trying to achieve and why we were doing it. And that's why that sense of stopping, collaborating and listening before you move forward. Not only do you make sure you've got a more accurate litmus test of what's happening within your school, but actually when it comes to any project, any change, you either bring people along on the journey where they've had a voice, or you drag them along and it's going to be a slower process. So all paths align the same. I think we can probably jump to our next slide, I reckon, Andrew.
So too.
And there's nothing controversial about this statement whatsoever, is there?
Who wrote this one, eh? This is in your,
well, yeah, I might be guilty of this one. It's often, I often use the explanation that as soon as I mention the word EdTech at an event, half the people in the room perk up and half run for cover. And it's a little bit the same when it comes to talking about educational technology. That there's some that view that the geeks need to control it because it's technology. And there's others that will say, hang on a second, this is pedagogy, this is education, it should be the teachers that are leading it. And actually, I kind of agree that the leading part absolutely should be pedagogy focused. And so often you need to have teachers involved. But I use the analogy of an F1 racing team. You know, if you build a car without asking for driver input and feedback, it's not going to handle correctly. It's not going to go around the corners and optimize, and you might not be able to see out the window when you get in it. But equally, you wouldn't want an F1 car that's been built by the drivers without having the best expertise from the technical team for the engine and the aerodynamics. And much in the same way, what we're recognizing, not least because of the pressures on everybody, is that there's such a breadth of technology and solutions that may, not will, but may be appropriate for your school, that this has to be done under co-production. It has to be bringing the strengths and experiences of different stakeholders together to make sure you shape. And actually, there are some geeks that can teach with experience, and there are some teachers that have become geeks, and there's a bit in the middle. But in most organizations, it shouldn't be one or two people. It should be a collective. You might need to appoint somebody to take the overall lead. And when that happens, and I'm sure you've had experience, Andrew, one of the key ones is for senior leadership to make sure they empower that individual to actually deliver. And sometimes leaders of digital can feel like they're in a bit of no man's land between operationally trying to deliver change and getting that support from senior leadership.
Yeah, we're at danger of agreeing all the time here, Al. We need to have some sort of disagreement to make sure this is engaging with people. When it comes to sort of the planning, it's interesting. When we were an EdTech demonstrator and I led the team, it was funny because whilst I'd been a tablet technology consultant maybe 10 years prior to that, I wouldn't say I was techie. I wasn't scared of it, but if there was something, I think teachers are like this. We're so invested in learning, invested in children learning, and accelerating that process and making it efficient. We have got a high bar, and I would keep that bar very, very high. I always came to it from a learning-centered point of view, but I wasn't scared of that technology. In the team, there were a number of people that were high-performing tech specialists. There were people that had created robots at university and got these fancy qualifications that had sold those on to places. But the core essence of it was that discussion, that collaboration, and actually us being aligned with regards to the vision, the intention, and making sure that actually we respected each other in that conversation because we're both working towards the same goal, completely aligned. And sometimes that meant that they would laugh at me because I'd ask a question and it was an obvious answer. And sometimes it was a case of me explaining explicitly what learning intention was, and actually some of the research that we've found, actually you can do, you can tailor how you use the multimedia platform in line with whatever your learning intention is. And ultimately it was a case of, right, I had the research around the pedagogy, and then it was about actually how can we nuance and adapt and facilitate with the platforms that we might already have. What I'll probably just add on there is when we're looking at the planning and work with people, I think being thorough and structured in that stage is crucial. Something that we use is the EEF implementation guidance, and it's familiar practice for lots of people, but ultimately it means that we are considered at each stage, including risk assessments, including that vision, including that long-term intention, but breaking it down into those smaller steps, as we've already sort of touched upon, is key.
I think some of this aligns as well. I mean, I use the example of an F1 car, which wasn't my most elegant one, but let's think of the challenge in schools at the moment with data. You know, data is a really good example where there are people with technical skills to understand where the data is stored and to utilize the tools to actually access that information. But data doesn't become information unless it's got a context. And that's a classic example where educators need to lead with what data is they need that will allow them to make informed decisions and provide interventions and support, but need the technical skills of others potentially to actually collate and produce that information. And that's one of many examples where, by the nature of our ever-changing landscape in our schools, it is a multi-skilled approach and a multi-stakeholder approach.
Yeah, completely. The only other thing that I would say in that planning stage is making sure that when we are be comfortable in the process, and actually it's not about executing the plan, it's about actually getting to the intended outcome. And I know lots of people look to the research, and there was a time when people were saying there's hardly any research out there. Ultimately, in our experience, when I was working with a large MAT, we did research-informed trials across different settings with different groups to make sure that we could identify effective practice. And when we could identify effective practice, it also gave us the opportunity, again with those Venn diagrams, to be able to accommodate different choices that allowed it to be personalised to setting, to the amount of technology that they might have, to the confidence and capability of the staff that were delivering that session, etc., and all the way through whatever pillars or requirements might be part of your setting and your vision and your intention, etc.
Hey, steady, we're coming on to pillars later. Don't spoil the reveal on that one.
Oh.
We could add TPAC as another Venn diagram example, but that's a good one when we start thinking about, we've got our pedagogical and our content knowledge as teachers and how technology overlaps where appropriate to give us that TPAC. And then around that, we can stick the ring of context and content. But I think all the time, that measure that you're referring there and sort of bringing it back to that constant check and balance and the pedagogy I think is really, really key.
Yeah, teachers and leaders are experts in learning, in pedagogy. And I think that puts them in an empowered position, and actually once they feel comfortable and confident and actually realise that some things are intuitive, and actually they should be by criteria, we should make sure that actually this isn't laborious to set something up that will have small gains. As teachers, we want everything, and rightfully so. We want something that's efficient and effective. We want more out than we put in. And I think when you pull those bits of the equation together, all of a sudden it's, oh yeah, I am in the driving seat. Oh yeah, I can identify when this is working and when it's effective. And I can triangulate that with the systems that might be in school.
Absolutely. And you know, while we cross-reference some of our narrative and our little meanders through some of the EdTech challenges, it's also worth knowing that any good technology vendor in the education space should be looking for that input and feedback and experience from teachers in how they shape the creation and development of the product. It's often a case of handing a finished product into the education space and seeing whether that's fit for purpose. But actually, the same way as we're providing that feedback and challenge within school, we can actually use that to make sure that solutions are fit for purpose from day one. And that sometimes gets missed. So that's another strand to think about.
Just on that point, actually, Al, it's interesting when you use the term sort of fit for purpose. Maybe we could explore that a little bit more. The one thing, let's say we're working with a school and they've got a platform that has free applications. So Microsoft, for example, is a raft of things there that allow you to use your teacher skill to think and to apply to the learning need, specifically to those children's next steps, personalized learning. In that sort of situation, the way we work with people is we're very much looking at things that allow us to make decisions and adjustments, and it isn't sort of, you're not clipping any wings, and actually it means that it can be utilized effectively because every situation might be different, settings are different. Is that still aligned?
Absolutely. I think when we think about good solutions, I mean, the bar has shifted and our checklist has shifted, and maybe something we come on to, but in a fundamental sense, the measure of a good solution is not just about the breadth of what it does. It absolutely now is measured much more about how agnostic and flexible it is, how easily it integrates into existing systems, how easy it is to actually use and maintain. And I think what we're recognizing is actually we have complex ecosystems happening in our schools with different solutions that are interlinked. And the measure is not to keep stacking on different layers that users need to be familiar with it in isolation, but how these solutions can actually bridge together in a more seamless way that minimizes the experience. So, you know, the best solutions are the ones you don't talk about. They just work. You just click an icon and off you go, and it does what you need to do, and you get the feedback you want. And maybe the better solution is the one where it doesn't do that. If you ask the question of a vendor, you find soon after there's an update that includes it. And that's how both, you know, we all develop and learn, don't we? So yeah, there's definitely a move on that. Maybe when we start talking in a little bit of time about how we select solutions, maybe we can also link that in at that point as well, Andrew.
Okay, lovely. We're definitely not going to finish on time, Al. We're going to have to
Well, let's not have the host panicking too soon. We'll do our best.
We did say it might be about 5:30, didn't we? Okay. Truth about world-class technology leadership is that it's 20% technology and 8% leadership. We've touched on this a little bit already, haven't we? And I think we talk about empowering and being aware and informed, and I think it's crucial. Is it any different with any type of school improvement? If you have someone driving it for sustained improvement and sustained impact, actually the leader has to be informed, has to have that knowledge, has to be involved in that. And ultimately that profile needs to be there in the same way when we're talking about quality assurance in settings as is. I think what I often feel is that by terming it EdTech and talking about technology and education, actually it's just effective pedagogy when we think about it. And of course, we've got to be really informed about when we're doing it. We've got to have a high bar and make sure that actually it isn't just shiny and actually is having impact. We've got to make sure that it is varied so that it's not just, oh, this is a pacifier. But ultimately, a key component is around leadership. I love this quote.
I think it's a really relevant one to pull in. I mean, the first thing is, you know, anybody who says this EdTech is going to magically transform your school or your student outcomes, frankly, I suspect won't have the quality backing of evidence. We have to be realists that these are about sometimes marginal gains, sometimes system-wide benefits and gains. Technology is the facilitator, the enabler. It enables good teaching to be great, potentially. It might enable greater engagement from learners, but it sits as one of those tools that's used in a school. And as we've alluded to before, often the biggest challenge with the implementation of any kind of change, any kind of tools, is about that clear messaging, that leadership, that focus on how we're going to do it. I often come across as being a bit, sounding like I'm conflicted, because I'll say one of the best recipes and advice I can give you for EdTech is less is more. And people say, well, hang on a second, Al, you've spent 30 years creating cool tools. What do you mean less is more? And it's not about don't have any EdTech, but actually less products implemented and embedded well, where you've got the right way of measuring impact, will be far better experience for the school, far better for staff in adopting new skills. And in the long term, will build confidence with the role of technology underpinning and being that facilitator that will allow you to build on in layers. And sometimes we saw it the last couple of years, you know, sometimes people for the right reasons with their enthusiasm tried to grab too many things and didn't really understand it. I think the leadership on here also, it's worth putting a note, and I frame it in a really constructive and sharing some empathy. But one of the challenges with digital and technology in schools, it's been on the agenda for a long time. Some schools have absolutely embraced it. Some it's been priority number 4. And until we got to the pandemic, it never really made it up near the top of the list. One of the challenges is those in leadership, by the nature of their experience and terms in office, developing through schools, may not always be the ones who've got the best practical experience of the role and the impact technology can have within teaching and learning. So it's one of those topics where it actually encourages strength of leadership to delegate and actually empower middle leaders and classroom teachers to actually help shape that vision. Of course, it's got to align right the way back to our priorities, school development plan, but it also empowers other people. And actually, sometimes the people you really want to talk to are the ones that have joined your school or MAT in the last year and have come from other settings where you want to pick their brains on what worked well for them, what tools were they using, what changes did they make, and that's part of that broader outward looking approach. And let's be honest, we've seen over the last couple of years a massive expansion in our personal learning networks, whether it's on social media, whether it's the breadth of online videos and podcasts and resources, but we are much more able now to go out and reach beyond. And I think we have to empower leadership to not only be willing to delegate and look elsewhere, but also remember that one of the things that perhaps we're not always brilliant at in our schools is top-down communication. We try, but in any environment where you've got so many spinning plates and so many pressures, it's not a surprise really, but communication is the key. And that is, to me, is the foundation of leadership. Yeah,
it certainly is. I think there's, when you use the word delegate, I do understand completely. Of course I do, as an executive leader and a head teacher. However, I think there's a difference between delegating and saying, that's sorted. They'll take care of that. And I know what you mean. And then the element of, oh, do you know what? They're the expert. I'm going to get involved in this. I'm going to be at those sessions because I once saw an image talking about technology. This is probably 10 years ago when people were buying lots of tablets for the settings. Mini iPads were their age. I remember they were small enough, but not too big, all this sort of stuff. But people were like, well, how do we use it? And I remember an image of a cart horse with an engine, a jet engine attached to it. It was a case of, we've got to be very, very careful here. Because if you turn this up, you're going to do loads of damage. And we've got to be very measured, very informed about what we're doing. But actually, if we're very sensible, we might get there a little bit quicker. And when we come to sort of leadership and training, it sort of does dovetail. What we would often do with when we were working with schools or MATs would be look at their school improvement systems that they already had in place, look at their implementation systems and their systems of embedding practice, and make sure that we had those conversations with them to make sure that it wasn't an add-on. And often what we found was that whilst we could deliver that training to people, and we were happy to deliver the training to people and provide a platform for cognitive load where these videos would be uploaded so that it wasn't too all-consuming at that time, it was very, very hectic and busy and demanding for people, was that actually those leaders said, no, you train us and we will disseminate that in collaboration with you. And I think that was a key sign that actually there's opportunity for that to be sustainably grown. And their intentions being realised, because actually their development, their growth, their confidence in leading that is almost in sync with the development of the school improvement.
Absolutely. I think we're at a good point, given time, to jump onto the next slide, because actually these couple of topics we're talking about here, they're not really ring fenced. They're absolutely a continuation of our conversation, and in many ways, I think we've really started to unpick this in terms of leadership. But you know, digital transformation is absolutely something that, as the quote says there, runs in parallel to actually embedding and maintaining and developing, depending on where you are on your journey, that culture of learning within your school. And it's key because I think all the time we talk about digital transformation, while sometimes I might open up that lens on digital to be all-encompassing within a school, at the heart of this, we've got to focus back into that pure teaching and learning as being the kind of the engine room for it. I think we'll keep quite brief on this one, but I'm going to pass across to you, Andrew, before we move on to the next.
Yeah, we've sort of touched on it a bit, haven't we? I'd just say that what I've already said around it not standing separately as EdTech, actually look at the systems that people have already got in place, the quality assurance, the monitoring, the development, all of those aspects. Actually, it should be interwoven into there. Are we making the right choices, right times, for the right reasons? Are they having impact? How are we disseminating those? And actually, schools have systems like that. Some schools collaborate incredibly well with others. And it's just about exploring those things that are there or cultivating them to make sure that you're actually in a position where you are mirroring that culture of learning that you might already have, and jumping on the back of that.
Absolutely.
We get through to the next one. What have we got next? Let's have a little look.
I think it's a big challenge, isn't it, now, facing us moving forwards?
Do you know, this one, and we've both got pet for reading stuff out, so we won't. But we shouldn't really talk while people are trying to read either. But the thing this always reminds me of is during remote learning, we had the whole country focused on multimedia learning on one area of education that in a way that we've never done before. And actually the rates of improvement and the rates of discovery and awareness were incredible. I remember we did an EdTech conference, and one of the sessions was around legacy of remote learning and whether afterwards we would be putting on those old slippers, those comfy slippers, and go, oh, we got through it, it's fine. And whether we were actually going to translate some of those effective strategies, those systems, that effective practice, that knowledge back into the classroom. I mean, I know we've talked briefly before about the power of feedback and how important that was, and how that could continue on. What are your thoughts, Al, on that?
I think there's a whole heap of areas here. We understand, often we have a conversation of post-pandemic, but in many schools we're still living in a somewhat pandemic in terms of resource pressures and challenges. I think where we kind of pose, and that quote from Alex, I think is really relevant, is much like any technology, you use it, you develop content, familiarity, muscle memory, and there's a risk that you fall back to that pre-position. Now, in some areas we won't. We all recognize that schools, whether they're a Microsoft or a Google infrastructure, most schools have discovered far more functionality within Teams or Google Classroom than they knew were there. And as you've alluded to, some of the solutions that provide quick and effective assessment, closing that feedback loop, are things I hope and expect many schools will continue to develop. We don't want to be in a position where if there's disruption to learning in the future, we've lost our skills. I was going to say with the synchronous, but pre-2020, I don't often remember hearing anybody talking about synchronous and asynchronous, but suddenly that was the term for every conversation. But I use the examples, challenges I've had within my own trust. Easter holidays, revision classes for our GCSE students, why our staff and students, or some of our students within the cohort, coming into school when potentially we could be doing those online, recording them, making them available to students that haven't engaged, staff well-being, less time traveling and so on. We've learned that it works when we have a blended model for parents' evening. Sometimes are harder to reach and engage with families, have engaged better with virtual sessions. It's been better for staff work-life balance. Actually, lots of people like the tools that pretty much limit that meeting to prevent the overruns and the drift throughout the evening. And there are lots of other tools that, in the bigger sense, how we're now able to see more data, join things together more cohesively, school to parent communication. And many schools have really developed that in both parents and the broader community in terms of our channels of sharing information digitally. So really this is about, I think we've all got an obligation, but absolutely school leaders have got an obligation to make sure that now we've acquired these skills, we don't let them drift. I would argue the most important reason why is because our learners need to have these digital skills, because just as things have changed in education the last 2 years, they've absolutely changed. It's been a paradigm shift in the workplace, and our workers of the future are going to be moving into a workplace that is hybrid, that is virtual, that is digitally led. And therefore it's incumbent on us to make sure that those kind of tools and solutions become interwoven in the fabric of teaching and learning. Now, as with all technology, where appropriate, I don't believe the measure of successful technology adoption is that it's used everywhere. Absolutely not. What I believe would be a successful measure is when we can stop talking about it, and it's just one of the tools and part of our normal teaching day. And I think that's where this just poses that question. It's a reminder to those listening to really focus on that.
Yeah, while you were talking then, Al, I wrote down balance. And I think that's the thing, one as well for engagement, but just for well-being as well. We've got to look at that big picture, the exposure that people get to technology elsewhere, and the research in that sense as well. But as I say, for me, if you're on a desert island and you gave a teacher a stick, they could teach some pretty good lessons. But it's again, it's about variety. That might get a little bit boring without that creativity and that potential to facilitate through those appropriate methods and platforms.
I think we're going to be jumping on to a quote from the EEF, who you've referenced before. And this is an interesting one, but one thing we've seen, I think more than ever the last 2 years. And maybe the catalyst has been there's been a huge growth in solutions that are available within the EdTech space, choices. And maybe we could also argue March 2020, actually for the first time in many schools, teachers were empowered to go and try new things, largely because we had to try and find ways to mitigate the disruption. Where we've moved on to now is recognizing that one of the key measures we need to think about is not just what does solutions and approaches do, what's the breadth of functionality, but actually bringing us back to that key measure, which is evidence. And evidence is all about what we do, how do we know it's being successful, how do we know it's having an impact. Now we're going to come on hopefully to a little bit about some of the things to consider when it comes to the technical evidence, but I think this is much more about how do we know it's having an impact. Now, one of the things where I think you and I come from a similar position, but I might be focused slightly broader, is as well as the considerations of educational impact on teaching and learning, there are other broader measures that strategically we're talking about in our trust now, where technology can not just hopefully enhance and have a positive impact on teaching and learning, but also can have a broader sense in terms of staff well-being, effectiveness of communication. If I go more strategic, well, staff well-being might also be a measure of staff retention, thinking about the efficiency of the systems that support the data and solutions around our schools. There could be economies of scale, efficiency. Actually, more often than not, the saving is time as much as it is money, but those are valuable commodities in the education space. Of course, there's that other side, the most important side, which is just because our children have a device in their hands or one device each throughout the day, and just because they're all connected and empowered, does that mean it's actually having a positive impact on teaching and learning? And I think that's the thing that I know your work in terms of EdTech Demonstrator has been actually making sure it's not just the device in hand, but it's the effective use of the device that's really key.
Yeah, I think you touch on elements that make me think about workload and staff workload, and when you're talking about well-being, and certainly there's nothing more rewarding when we're thinking about those sorts of things, when you're working with people that might describe themselves as tech phobic, and then all of a sudden they're like, wow, this is brilliant, I've cut down my marking, or actually the impact of that marking, the usefulness of that time, it's been transformed because I've recorded a sound note and sent it to the child, and actually they can hear what I'm meaning and infer much better than having to read it. So I think the other thing you touched upon was the sort of the wider elements that technology can benefit in education. And with the Education Exchange, one of the projects that we put on offer to people is around Power BI. And when we're looking at Power BI, it allows leaders to make strategic decisions, to get quickly to actions and purposeful actions, informed actions that can then have impact. And so couldn't agree more with the fact that there's a raft of different elements that we can and we should be sort of being aware of and exploring. So yeah.
Excellent. Shall we jump on in our last 5 or 10 minutes and talk a bit about champions and picking EdTech?
Yeah, I think the thing with the Education Endowment Foundation research as well is that it really does talk about how the nuances and the variables within the case studies and the research projects actually had can potentially lead to, oh, we think we're getting it right, and then the outcome is not as expected, and actually there wasn't the impact. And I think that can put people in a position of, of feeling in a bit of a fog or a soup, because actually we think this is going to be, is it or isn't it? And what I would say in that situation is, look at your quality assurance systems, get in there, have a look at that impact, see the learning taking place, and make sure that you're being really, really robust in that, and really making sure that you feel comfortable setting that bar high, like we've talked about already. Have high expectations. If it doesn't meet it and you're unsure, then you're unsure. So it's not about spreading, sharing, investing even more in it. Reach out, collaborate with people, and see what everyone else is doing, because more often than not, you'll find like-minded individuals that are generous, open, and maybe are going through the same thing as you, and you can pull resources together, or maybe they've been through it already, or know someone has and can connect you.
Absolutely.
Okay, this is one of yours, I think. I mean, develop champions for different strands and support each other. And what I would say is that there's a few slides now, I think, that are very much from your slide deck, which is,
I think I'm sharing a view of many on these topics. I always refer to myself as an edu sponge, which is a polite way of saying I've just assimilated loads of other people's ideas and like to share them. This is one I can reflect on from my own mat, and I think we've seen all over the world. You know, if you look within your school, one of the best ways to facilitate confidence for teachers looking and starting to use new technology is to signpost those people around the school that already have confidence using the technology, the go-to people. That encourages people to have a try and have confidence they've got somebody they can ask a question for. It helps if you think in a broader sense around a larger mat. We've seen mats that didn't even know that other schools within the mat were using similar tools, or there were people with real strong skills and confidence using tools effectively. And again, we could signpost that so we can see that and share for it. And also part of wanting to keep that continuous measure is you need champions that are not only representing different products or solutions or approaches within your school or your mat, but they're also the people that you can go to get the evidence, that constant progression of, are we moving forward? Is it having the impact that we want? And again, I think it empowers lots of different people. I often call them the flag bearers in the school. Who's my go-to Teams user, or my go-to curriculum software user, or my go-to, whatever it may be. I mean, in most schools, we know who's good at organizing the schedule for all the lessons during the day and doing the lesson planning at the start of the academic year, and we'll know where our Senko is. But actually, digital champions for different tools, I think, is a really important one. And again, I think the question is, do you know yourself? Think about the tools in your school. Do you know who the go-to people are? If you do, great. And if you don't, well, maybe others don't too, and it's a good chance to signpost them.
You reminded me of a project that the Education Exchange ran, but right in the early days when we first started, around a year ago. It was a rapidly growing trust in the South that wanted an independent review of the platforms that they were using, the IT infrastructure, because they were having new schools join them and they were all using different platforms and systems. And we partnered up with another member of the Education Exchange. So we had different platforms represented within that audit process. And lo and behold, there was a school within that group that were absolutely, not just absolutely on the cutting edge of effective practice, but were so comfortable and confident and proficient at facilitating across their school that within the final report, it was a case of we had to identify them as a strength to be able to lead that change and support others. And again, that went across things such as sharing of resources and making sure you collaborate on work across different sites.
Shall we take a quick fast track through our next little couple of rubric slides, and then we can hopefully we'll be just in time to have a few questions at the end. We've included this as much as it can be a takeaway for people who are watching, and I'm hopefully we're going to share a PDF of this. We've talked about all the kind of topics around digital vision, but at some point you're going to ask the question, well, we need a new solution. What are some of the pitfalls, or how do we go about selecting it? And Andrew and I are also firm believers that you can apply very much the same questions to what you've already got, doing that reflective practice and actually measuring. So this rubric over a couple of slides really starts with, you want to pick a solution, split the strands. One, from a technology point of view, whether it will work in your infrastructure, it's got the right privacy policies, will pull in your student data. And then secondly, does it align with the curriculum? Is it something new, or is it just replacing something you've already got? And have you got clarity and understanding of what it's designed to do? And then if we jump to the second slide, assuming we've got some big ticks for all those elements, as if by magic, we then go into the kind of process of, have we actually sat down, have a team, whether it's our flag bearers, part of our Dig group, have we actually vetted the solution to make sure it's right and appropriate? Has the vendor done a presentation and actually walked you through the expectations, capabilities, and given you a chance to challenge on the limitations? Has it been evaluated in the classroom? And I think that's a key one we see now. Never, never, never be afraid to say, I need to extend my evaluation. I need to try this more. Good vendors should be happy that you're trialing a solution in your school. Have you done any comparisons, pilots? Have the teachers who've been trialing software actually fed back their views on a positive or a minus and how it's worked together. And then finally, if you've got ticks in all those boxes, you can go to the next step of actually making a decision about whether you want to adopt a solution. Now, that's a really simplistic summary, but it's just adapts to suit your school setting, but a way of just reminding you some of those key ticks.
It's almost when we go through an EEF implementation plan, that process, you're bringing up certain elements that would come through in that sort of rubrics, that flowchart of yours as a vendor and what have you. And ultimately, there might be certain constraints. I think at the end, it talks about the financial element. If you're meeting with, if we were meeting with a school and it's a case of, right, we haven't got the money, this is what we have, what can we do? How can we then look at the plan financially moving forward to make sure that degradation of devices and things like that are mitigated and risk assessed and things like that? It's a huge chunk of money if people aren't doing it right, but it's really refreshing to hear you almost give the inside track of ask for a further extension, make sure that you're getting that training that's making sure that those leaders are in a position to be the experts and take ownership and drive things forward.
Definitely.
I think we've got one more around pillars, haven't we, Al?
We have got one slide just as an idea, and I think we both agree that every school will have their own set of priorities or aspects that they think are important. This is sharing one. It's the pillars that we identified within our map, but I think we're pretty well aligned on this. Obviously, the devil's in the detail under those different categories. But when you're thinking of your digital strategy, it's important to break it down so that different people can take a lead and direction on different areas. And I see Christina's arrived to give us a quick reminder and nudge. There are some suggestions. One about focusing on the key strand of innovating learning, your students' digital skills as well as your teacher skills. Of course, you've got to have that foundation to build any aspirations for technology, your infrastructure, fostering effective communication, and now more than ever, that final pillar there is about functionality and technology that can support well-being, whether it's from an SMH perspective, whether it's from a staff well-being perspective, whether it's just about facilitating extra support and nurture for our SEND children. And they all wrap together. And I think our final slide, because we're at the end, is just, if you want to discover more, find out more, then please reach out to myself, Andrew. Education Exchange obviously provide lots of support and resources and opportunities to support schools. I'm always happy to engage and check and collaborate with people online. And I thought I'd better just drop in at the end there. If you want to find out more about some of the topics we've been talking about today, then check out a bright yellow book, My Secret EdTech Diary.
Shameless.
It's a very small part of the screen though, isn't it? I think that's us on our 50 minutes.
Time as well, Al. Would you have thought it?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that. Very insightful, and as you say, I started to write a small poem, but I've not finished it yet. I've only got to 10 lines. Just picking up on some of your words. Pedagogy was the word of the session. Golden circle, and yeah. So I tell you what, I did really like. One particular statement that you made was the. In my poem, I put EdTech interwoven into the fabric of interwoven into the fabric. I like that word of technology and teaching and leading. I like those words. Anyway, brilliant session. We have got some questions for you, so I won't ramble on anymore. So one of the questions is, can you tell us more about how the Education Exchange has helped a trust implement digital strategies?
Yeah, so ultimately, the way the Education Exchange works, we've delivered over 800 projects in our first year, all for free, by the way. Should really emphasise that. Should have said that right at the beginning. It's true to its ethical principles of just improving outcomes and opportunities for all pupils, no matter what school uniform. Ultimately, the way the model works is we would identify a school that's or an organisation that's had impact in a specific area in the same way that you would like to, and we take that leader who's got those expertise, that experience, who's been through those lethal mutations and speed bumps and what have you, got the confidence and knowledge that it's going to get through to impact and realisation, and then we put them in the setting, the other setting, the setting that wants to partner up and adopt that school improvement area in that similar way. And ultimately what they would do is they would, and of course each project is bespoke and sometimes it's multiple members, but in its essence, what we do is we would look at a certain period of time, let's say 6 weeks, and we would take that expert, that leader who's already tried and tested, had sustained impact, proven impact, put them in the other setting for maybe an afternoon, a week for those 6 weeks. They're at the chalk face. We're not just sharing resources. They're at the chalk face, leading and implementing themselves with those experience and expertise that they've already got. And so when we have worked with other trusts with regards to their e-learning and edtech development, whilst we have that model, we are nuanced to their setting. And as I mentioned throughout the session, we look at what systems they've got in place. One example is coming to our mind about a trust that had a rapid improvement. They nominated e-learning leads straight away in each setting. They put up, it had an infrastructure of trialing, researching, and disseminating that information. And then actually what they did is they asked us to then almost chair those sessions where they were sharing the practice and their findings, and so that they could actually form their own almost handbook with regards to e-learning, their digital strategy. And what was interesting there was that whilst we were facilitating that discussion, and whilst in the early stages we were there saying, right, there's these people that are there to partner up with and touch on their expertise and learn from. Ultimately, their confidence and the empowerment of that project meant that they absolutely skyrocketed with regards to what they were doing, and it was fueled from within. And I think that's a crucial element. It's ownership, it's collaboration, it's empowerment. And in that sense, there was a uniqueness to their setting, to their different pillars, if you like, with regards to staffing capacity, with regards to commitment, with regards to financial, with regards to infrastructure. And we worked alongside that to make sure that we were providing and delivering on their vision rather than just translating and saying, right, okay, here you go, here are the answers. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, so we've got another question here. What sorts of technology do you see being used effectively in schools?
Oh, that's an exciting question, isn't it? I think the first one is not to set expectations, which is just remember every school and every cohort's different. So there's not a mirror that everybody's got to manage the same. I think what we've absolutely seen is some of the tools that allow us to quickly not only set assessments and interaction with our students, but actually see their level of engagement. And as we talked about earlier, closing the feedback loop, whether it's using in the Microsoft setting Teams or in Google Classroom plugins like Moat and others that allow you to create quickly and effectively voice notes. That's work, and it has really become more embedded. I'm not saying everyone's got it perfect yet, but it's like all things, we're on a journey. I could reference, of course, the online parents' evening software has been very effective. I think we can look in more detail. For a lot of schools, we've seen certainly at secondary, some of the more focused personalized learning solutions, some that come with a bracket of using AI, but the ones that in effect encourage stretch, or if children are struggling, take them back a few levels to embed knowledge, not to replace, but to sit alongside and support some of the catch up. They've worked really well. Looking at solutions now, and we keep mentioning this flex and agnostic approach, looking at solutions that when we're using them, we don't want a solution in the classroom and a solution out of the classroom. We want solutions that work irrespective of setting. And I think we've seen a big change in terms, partly initiated by a continual move towards the cloud for certain platforms and core technologies, that we're looking now at solutions that can flex as much as we need to as schools. And so there's been growth in there. The most important thing has not been how we've assimilated loads more tech. It's that over the last 18 months, we've become much more confident in the tech we already had. We just didn't know how to use it effectively.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Yeah, like you say, with the pandemic, we were forced into using it, and it's been really good because everybody's they've had to use it, and it's actually working really, really well. And we've come on so much in the past 18 months because of that. So I think it's an ever-changing world, isn't it? The digital world and technology, and it's just going to it enhances. It's got to definitely. It's enhancing the education sector definitely from what I can see already as well. Thank you so much for speaking today. We've let everybody know in the chat your Twitter handles and how to contact you to ask any questions. And of course, everybody that's registered onto this can rewatch everything anyway. It'll be ready, did you say, in a week's time? So all these sessions will be ready to view again in a week's time, so they can be utilised again. But again, thank you so much for your time. Really nice to meet you both. We're going to have to bid you adieu because we have Rebecca Ricketts on next in about 4 minutes, to be precise.
Thank you.
Thanks, Al. Appreciate it. Take care, all.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, Christina.